The term weakness is something that I often hear thrown around in the chess education sphere, especially by grandmasters and other titled players. It's often taken to be a kind of assumed knowledge about positional chess that's too basic to even be explained, but for a lot of us regular players it may be unclear what the criteria of a weakness is and how we can identify them. Which is why in this video I'm going to clear up the confusion with 5 key aspects of what makes a weakness and show you a variety of positions where you can play along in trying to identify the weaknesses yourself. All of this culminating in a final position where you can try and win the game by exploiting the weaknesses to the max. Because as much as you and I may enjoy learning this stuff for the love of the game, we are also here to win. Okay, beneath me now I'm going to put my 5 key aspects of what makes a weakness, and I will leave it there visible so that you can refer to it throughout the video as we try and solve these positions. The first thing is that we're only going to be discussing pawns today. There is such a thing as a weak square or a weak piece, or a poorly placed piece rather, but in this video the main concept that we're going to be covering is what is a weak pawn. The second aspect of a weakness is that it cannot be easily traded. Think of things like backwards pawns. If that's a new term to you, I can illustrate it right here on this board in that a backwards pawn is not a pawn which can be pushed forward without losing it. Like in this position you can see that white has a bunch of pieces defending the square in front of the pawn and it is unable to move forward, and it has nowhere near enough support from the black pieces. The third aspect is that a weakness cannot be protected by another pawn. As you can see in this position, there is no pawn that can defend our friend here on e6. The fourth aspect is that a weakness cannot easily be protected by an active piece. As you can see in this position, the only real way that black could try and protect e6 would be by putting a knight on f8 or something like that, which would be a very passive way to defend it. There is no way to go to g5, f4, d4, or c5, which would all be active squares in which the knight could protect. Additionally, the rook has no way to access some kind of defensive posturing on g6, for example, and because the pawn is on a light square, this bishop cannot get involved. And the fifth and final, and probably the most important aspect of weaknesses is that they must be attackable by the enemy pieces. We are the enemy in this position, we are the white pieces, and our opponent has this weakness on e6. And the reason this pawn is a weakness is because it has checked off every single previous criterion on our checklist, as well as the fact that it is easily attackable by our big pieces. As you can see, this rook here can attack the pawn very easily from the e1 square, pressuring on e6. The knight can jump in and start to pressure on e6 as well, which means that this e6 pawn is a big time weakness. And in fact, white is pretty much just winning after the move knight g5, because not only are we threatening the pawn on e6, which as I mentioned is the big weakness, but we're also threatening a fork here. So white is completely dominating the position. And very importantly, black cannot push forward the weakness with a counterstrike because we would just capture it. So this is a very basic illustration of what a weak pawn is. e6 has no neighbors, there's no way for an active piece to easily protect it, it's very easily accessible by our own pieces, and cannot be traded off for another pawn. Okay, now onto a second position. This one's also not crazily difficult, but we're going to be trying to identify who between white and black has the weak pawns in this position. And I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Okay, now that I've given you a couple of seconds, we're going to talk about what the weak pawn is. Well, in this position, white has a glaring weak pawn on b2, and I'm going to explain to you why this is such a weak pawn by going through the checklist. Well, this pawn cannot be easily traded, it cannot go up to b3, and it cannot be pushed to b4 because of the en passant rule. In both cases of pushing the pawn, you would be able to capture it. This is a super important construction, by the way, one pawn protecting against two. The b2 pawn also has no neighboring pawns which can protect it, and it would be very impressive if white could move a pawn to the first rank, but unfortunately that is an illegal defense. The fourth thing is, can this pawn be protected by an active piece? Well, no, not at all. In fact, the only squares that the white rook could go to would be c2 and b1, and these are very passive squares. I might go into more depth in a future video on what makes a piece passive, but the basics is that a passive piece cannot attack a weakness. So you can see just how important the concept of weaknesses are. They completely underpin all of positional chess. And the final step is that this weakness must be easily attackable by an enemy piece. Well, we've already got a rook lined up attacking Barry the b pawn, so he is definitely under a lot of pressure and is confirmed a weak pawn. Now, you may also think, okay, but black has a weak pawn on a4, right? Well, Not quite, you're a bit mistaken there. And the reason is that yes, pretty much all of the aspects of the weakness are there for the A pawn, other than one, which is that it is not easily attackable by an enemy piece. This rook would have to move 1, 2, and 3 to take the pawn here. Meanwhile, our rook would just capture this guy in one move and already stir up counterplay with moves like d3 exploiting a pin. So for example, if white wants to go on the active defense and try to win our own a pawn, we would just take this one, they would go rook a7, we would play d3, they could take this one, and we would just win the game here because we're now up a pawn, and it would have these two connected passed pawns after the exchange here, something like here, here, takes, and takes, and this is a completely winning position for black with this pawn pushing here. I mean, black can go and pressure the weakness, and our king is able to be an active piece, easily defending our own pawns. So because white cannot go for the active defense, white must settle for the passive defense, in which this weakness becomes even more obvious, and black can start to press forward in the position with their other pawns, maybe play a move like rook to b3 and completely and utterly dominate the position. Okay, now on to position number 3. I'm going to give you a few seconds to try and identify which pawns you think are a weakness in the position. Okay, now that you had a little second, I'm hoping that you guys didn't say that the e6 pawn is a weakness for black. And the reason it's tempting to say this is that, well, the pawn has no neighbors, the pawn is under attack, the pawn cannot be pushed forward, but guess what? The pawn is easily protected by an active piece. This king here on f6 is quite an active piece, and it is protecting the pawn, so in fact, I would not consider the e6 pawn to be a weakness. The pawn on a4 for black is also not a weakness for very, very similar reasons to the last position, where the white rook is unable to attack it in any way, so this one is also not a weakness. But on the other hand, this b2 pawn is a big weakness because it forces the white rook to be passive on the second rank. We are easily pressuring it, it cannot move forward, it has no neighbors, and therefore the b pawn is in fact the only weak pawn in the position. Now, whether or not this one weakness is enough for black to win the game, I'm unsure, but it is 100% black who is pressing in this position. Okay, now this one is a very, very interesting one and will require you to do a little bit of concrete calculation and planning in order to uncover the weaknesses in this position. I'll give you a couple seconds to figure it out. Okay, hopefully you guys have had a good go at that, but in this position it will require a little bit of creative thinking because the position is so close. Like, both sides have 8 pawns, everything seems kind of walled off. So you have to come up with this interesting idea to get to the doubled pawns, because at the end of the day, one of these guys is in fact the weakness. Both pawns have no neighbors, they have no other pawn to protect them, and both of them require a passive defense from the rook. The pawns also cannot be easily traded, as they have no way to go forward other than dying at the hand of our own pawn. So the only thing that we are missing is a way to attack them. Well, luckily we have just that with this very, very nice pawn break with c6. And you might be thinking, well, surely they can just go c4 here, right? And then after this trade, then look, white's defending their pawn. Well, that's not the right way to think about it, because we've already made big progress here, because now we are pressuring the weak pawn, which must be defended by the white rook. This pawn still has no neighbors and still has no way to be traded off or pushed forward. But also, very importantly, we actually unlock a hidden weakness in the position, so extra credit if you said a2 pawn is also extremely weak, because we have an easy way to attack it, and it's insanely difficult for white to go and defend this one. They would have to go back like to a1, but then they would drop the c2 pawn. So this is where you might have heard the phrase, a principle of two weaknesses is what you need in order to win a position. Like in this one, because both of these two pawns are weak and none of our own pawns are weak, because it's impossible for the white rook to go and attack any of them, black is actually winning here. So for example, white might want to play a move like that. We don't get hasty, by the way, and play this move, because then maybe white can play this, and even though they're passive, now they only technically have one weakness because they're able to put the rook on a square where both of them are protected. So instead of playing that hasty move, we should first play b5 and b4 to lock down both of the weaknesses very nicely here. And after king d2, rook a3, we'll just collect the a2 pawn, and we're going to win the game fairly easily with our extra pawn. Now, very interesting thing, I'd like you to compare this position here with this position here. And the big difference is that this pawn has not moved forward 2 squares. The reason that white doesn't really have a weakness in this position, even though the pawns are doubled, the pawns are capable of being pushed forward. Like this move c4 would mean that white has all of their pawns easily protecting each other, and the only pawn that you could try and make an argument for being a weakness would be c2 or a2, but these pawns are not easily accessible for our rook, as we have no way to break open any of these files and try to invade with the rook. And for example, if you try and play c5 to do some kind of rook lift here, then white would already be able to easily move their rook over to the b file, and we are not in time to move our rook over to a6 because our own weak pawns would drop off the board. We'd have to play something like b6 here, and then there is simply no progress to be made on either side. White has set up the brick wall, black has walled themselves in with their own brick wall, and this position would in fact be equal. So it's a very interesting concept here that if you do actually have weak pawns, then you don't want to try and lead like this to trade them off. Leading with this pawn is very dangerous because it means that this pawn here cannot be pushed forward. It's almost always a better idea to try and lead with your doubled pawn, or even just avoid touching it at all to try and maintain maximal square control. Okay, with all of those warm-ups out of the way, I think you guys are ready for the final test. This is a really cool position, and black is the one trying to win. It is black to move. First thing you need to do is identify all of the weaknesses of white, and then try and find a way to exploit them all to the max, break through the position, and win the game. Okay, I hope you enjoyed finding all of those weaknesses. Congratulations if you pointed out b2 as a weakness, c5 as a weakness, and also g3 slash kind of h3 as well as a weakness. This is just an abysmal position for white. All of these weak pawns and all of black's pawns are very nicely defended by an active bishop here. So black essentially has 0 weaknesses. These pawns are inaccessible, and like I said, all of them are easily protected by the bishop. But pointing out white pawns as all being weaknesses is all well and good unless you can actually find a way to break through. Now, this position is actually taken from Nimzovich's My System, and the solution that he gave is actually just wrong, which is kind of funny, but of course he was calculating and playing stuff a very long time ago. Nimzovich's suggestion is actually King e5, which he says is a great move. And the reason he says that is because after rook to b4, black plays King d5, and he says this position here is a zugzwang because white doesn't want to move their bishop back, as that would drop the c5 pawn. And additionally, if white goes back like this, then he says the h4 is a great move because black gets to the h3 weakness, and after takes, you can take on c5, first attacking the rook. The bishop cannot go to f2 with a check because you would sacrifice and then take the rook here. And if you try and instead move the rook back, then he says take the h3 pawn and claims this is a winning position for black, which unfortunately it isn't, by the way. So if you found this as a solution, then pretty well done, because this is what Nimzovich thought, and Nimzovich was obviously a great player, but it is not quite the engine-approved win. The engine-approved win in this position is very slow, very methodical, and I think quite beautiful. The engine-approved win starts with king to f5. Very nice move, and the idea is that you want to play a pawn up to g4. The reason you're doing this is because you're actually overprotecting the rook, and additionally, if they capture this way, you want to be taking with the king and invading the position such that you can put additional pressure on the g3 weakness. So, for example, if white just stalls with the move rook b4, shuffling back and forth, then you would play a pawn to g4. If you capture it, the black king can capture it, and let's say that they go king f1, trying to stop your infiltration here, because if they just move back and forth like this and this and this, well, then you're going to kick out the bishop, and this position is just going to be terrible. Like, the bishop has to move back. It's super passive, and you could even start to consider ideas like rook d3, rook c5, attacking the pawn over here. If white tries to defend it, then you have rook b3 attacking the other weak pawn, and everything just starts to collapse there. So instead, after king g4, white may attempt something like king f1, but then we have king h3, and if they try to play king g1, then we even have a really nice idea: rook g3 takes, and the two passed pawns are simply going to be too much, and they will win the game for black. So something like rook d4, e3, king f1, h4, King e2, h3, you can win the pawn, but the h pawn makes it to the end of the board, and black will win the game. So going all the way back here, you cannot really capture this pawn, and additionally you have to push the pawn because otherwise black will take you and then just promote, so white is forced to play the move h4. But now that we've got this g4 move in the position, our rook has extra protection, which means that e3 now becomes a threat at certain points. Unfortunately, we cannot rush with the move e3, because then bishop to e1 and white is holding the fort, because you can claim that all of these pawns are weaknesses as much as you want, but we don't really have a way to attack them, and now our rook is also kind of tangled up on the f3 square, and that was meant to be our most active piece, which we're going to use to take all of the white pawns. Also very important in this position is that if we try and run our king over to attack this weak c5 pawn, then white is just in time with the move b3 to trade off one of their weaknesses here. So that after like takes, if they go king d4 trying to attack our weak pawn over here, then we get rook d3 first, taking here, and then we get to pick up their own weak pawn. And given this is an opposite colored bishop, this will simply just be a drawn position, like bishop goes here, king goes here, and if anyone's going to lose, maybe it is black, because black's going to have to put their bishop on the passive defense. But don't worry, black isn't losing here anyway. So instead of playing e3 right away, black plays the ultra-patient king e5, where after rook b6, the shuffling continues. Now we play king d5, and after the rook goes to b4, it is in this position that we play e3. Because after bishop takes on e3, we play rook takes on g3, still we have no real weaknesses, we've gained a passed pawn, c5 is still pressured by our king, and h4 remains a big time weakness on top of b2. So in this position, black would be completely winning, ready to push the pawn down the board and win the game. So white decides, no, I'm not going to take this pawn on e3, but then after bishop to e1, you'll see why it was so important that we have the active king pressuring white's weak pawns, because now we can just capture this guy on c5 and have a winning game in the long run. We'll play moves like bishop to b5, which is essential that we had this pawn on g4, because now the rook has extra protection and we'll be able to kick the king out of the board, get in there, pressure white's weaknesses even more. So one example continuation here is rook to f4, trying to exchange rooks and go into the opposite color bishop ending, but even this one is actually winning, because after bishop to b5 check, we force the king to a very passive square. The white bishop has no way to attack our so-called weakness, and therefore it's not a weakness because they can't attack it. And we can even just simply capture the rook here, takes, and in fact the white pawn is a very weak pawn because our active piece is able to attack it. And white really has not a whole lot to do here. Let's say they check, we play king e4, now g3, g2 is a big threat, they have to even go back, and we just collect this pawn on f4. Followed by g3, g2, king g2, and we're going to be promoting because the white king has no way back into the position. So hopefully this video explained to you what a weakness is and how you can exploit them in your own games so that you too can grind like a grandmaster. If you did enjoy the video and like my style of teaching and might be interested in some one-to-one coaching, then do check the description, send me an email. I do have a couple of places left and I'll be able to take you on as one of my students. But other than that, thank you very much for watching this far, and I'll see you all in another video. Bye!